Okay, so let's take a quick look here. I want you to implement, create an application here that does the following. So I'm going to run this. First off, you ask the user how many elements they will like in either array. And so let's type in here 4. Then your application should let the user enter the elements for the first array, where there will be 4 elements. So I'm just going to put here 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then you should ask the user for the elements of the second array. Notice that we're populating 2 arrays. And then once you do that, your application should then print both arrays. Notice that array 1 is all the elements 1, 2, 3, 4. That comes from right here. And array 2 is all the elements also from 1, 2, 3, 4, which comes from right there. And then finally, your application should basically compare the 2 arrays that were entered by the user, compare every number, corresponding numbers, by the way. So like the first element, the 0th element on both arrays, the first element, the second element, the third element, and ask it itself, the application should ask itself, are the arrays identical? And we say the word strictly identical to say that every number here matches with its corresponding number. So if I was to run this again, and I would enter, okay, well, I'm going to have 2 arrays that both have 4 elements in it, and the first array has the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, but the second array has the numbers 5, 6, 7, and 8, then your application should, once again, print the 2 arrays that were entered by the user, or the elements were used to populate those. Excuse me, the elements were populated using these values entered by the user. And notice here that it's the application determines that the arrays are not strictly identical. That means that they're not equal. And this should happen even if there's only one value that is not identical. So let me do, that's the first array. Then if I do the second array, and then instead of a 4 here, I put any other number. Notice that they match on the most part, but the last element on both arrays, they're not equal. So 4 and 5 are not equal, so they're not strictly identical. So that's the goal. The goal is ask the user for the length of the arrays. So that basically determines how many times you're going to ask the user to enter a number so that it can be stored, in this case, in the first array. Notice that. And then you'll then ask again for all the elements of the second array. Notice that you'll again ask only for 4 elements because the user entered a 4. Then you display the arrays just so that the user can see that these were stored appropriately in an array, and they were. Finally, you determine whether the elements in the arrays are identical, strictly identical, and the application displays whether they are not strictly identical or whether they are. And so let me then talk a little bit about, because I have the code here, but obviously I don't want to share all the code here. What I've done is right here. Here it is. So what I've done is I've basically replaced quite a lot of the code that I wrote and placed comments where you need to write some code. Let me talk a little bit about this. So I've written this compare method or function. We'll call it function. It has 2 parameters, A and B, and they're both going to be arrays. A is going to be an array. B is going to be an array. I've made this variable called identical, which is initialized to true. And then I am asking you then to do the following, which is once you initialize identical to true, I want you to implement a for loop to traverse both arrays. Notice that the arrays will have the same number of elements, and compare corresponding elements. Just compare them. And if a pair of elements are not identical, then you would set identical to false, and then we return identical back to wherever it was called, wherever compare was called. So then I've made the main function here, the main method, I guess. We first ask the user, we prompt the user for the size of the arrays, and then I want you to initialize array 1, R1, to be zeros, all zeros, as many zeros as the user enters. So notice if the user entered a 4, like I did on the example over here, um, R1 would have 4 zeros in it, 4 elements that are all zeros, and so would R2. So the lines of code on line 14 and 15 should be identical, with the exception of the 1 and the 2 there. And then I've shown you here how we can basically traverse an array. So on line 17, I use a for loop. So it says for x in range of size. Now, if you don't recall how range works, let me talk about it for a minute here. Range, say suppose I put here range 4. Then what it gives me, this it gives me a list, and don't confuse that with an array because it's not so much an array. So it will basically give me a range of numbers that start at 0 and will go all the way up to 1 less than 4. So 0, 1, 2, 3, that's it. And so the way the for loop works is as for x in the range of numbers here. Notice that size I've specified it as 4 per the example that I gave earlier. So x will be a 0, and we'll put here r1 of 0 equals whatever the user enters, right? And then x will be a 1, so that's the next number, and so that would be r1 of 1 equals whatever the user enters. Recall that we have a way to allow the user to enter values. It's the input function, but it's a little bit more to it than that when we enter a numeric value. And then x will be 2, so that would be r1 of 2, and then x will be 3, that would be r1 of 3. And I basically replicated the same thing, but to populate r2 here in a separate loop. So this code from line 17 all the way to line 23 is basically going to handle this right here. This. Okay, once you've populated the arrays, we are going to print them. Notice I print here array 1, and then I made array R1, I've made it a string. So it's a list. It is an array. It's a list of numbers. Making it a string lets us print it like we have right here. And I've done the same for R2, so that's good. And then finally, we get to this part where on line 28, I'm saying that R identical, that variable, equals what compare returns when I send it R1 and R2. Notice R1 and R2 here are called arguments. They're arguments that I'm sending to this compare function. Well, in the compare function, they'll be stored locally in the variable A and the variable B. We call those parameters. So basically, I'm sending R1 and R2, which again are these arrays that I have right here on the Python shell right here. I'm sending them to compare. Compare is going to return to me identical, which will either be true or false. And that will be stored in this variable called R identical. And I'm going to say that if R identical is true, then that means the two arrays, R1 and R2, are actually strictly identical. So I'll print this. And else, meaning if R identical is not true, if it's false, I'll print here that the arrays are not strictly identical. And so that's the objective here. I want you to write the code here that is going to let you, it's basically going to implement this application.